Keith Littlewood, Tomo, Alannah Connealy, welcome back to the podcast. We're waiting on one more. Hopefully he turns up sooner rather than later. Hopefully everything's okay. But I invited you all onto the podcast to discuss cancer, the big C, not the COVID, the cancer, and what you've kind of came across in Alannah writing your book, Keith doing your PhD, and then of course Georgie's research. But we were just having an interesting conversation there around stress. So, Alannah, if you don't mind, I think we'll just start with you here, what you were just saying before we kind of get into the more sciencey aspect of it. What were you saying around stress? And you had listed five different types of stressors that really seem to be fuel on the fire for cancer. That it's not just always the chemical as we perceive it, like the externals, the PUFAs, the alcohol, the smoking, whatever, that there is something deeper that can be a driver for stress or cancer that a lot of us don't even consider.
Yeah, well, I used to work at my mom's cancer center. She is a MD that treats cancer. And so I would meet patients all the time. And I basically came up with like personas that I recognized, like patterns of people that came into the clinic to get treatment. And so the number one thing was divorce. If they had just gone through like a nasty divorce that seemed to uh kind of precede a cancer diagnosis sometimes. Of course, a lot of people go through divorces, not everyone does it, but I just noticed these patterns. Number two is loss of a child, which I mean, it's a kind of grief. My brother passed away, and so I personally know how that impacts the parents, especially. Obviously, like no parent should have to bury their child. And so a lot of times I've seen that too. And then abuse at home, like especially in early life, you're more likely to get cancer. It also triggers early menstruation, so you're more exposed to ovulation, which is more estrogen. So that could be the actual mechanism at play, but just a very common thing to be like abused early on, and then being a caretaker for somebody.
Yeah, so
Oh,
stressful.
and work related stress, like a very stressful job. That's the last one. That's the last persona. Yeah.
And Keith, you had mentioned that there's a lot of women that used to come into your practice and they had had something happen in the past that influenced their health outcomes, hence why they're coming to you.
Yeah, I mean the it's quite a varied spectrum from onset of menstrual cycle at 9 years of age, 8 9 years of age to disordered eating starting at 13, whether it's kind of just being worried about physique or maybe even overachieving in athletic arenas. Again, that might have come with kind of malnutrition from physical performance outcomes, and not eating enough, and all the other things that tend to go with a younger lifestyle. So yeah, I often found that tracing it back to kind of what was going on in teenage years and when it started, and then you start to see the other things planted on top, whether it's use of oral contraceptives or alcohol consumption is one of the things that you picked up on earlier on. All of the excess alcohol consumption might be a key driver as well. So it could be any one of those things. But I think, as we talked about earlier on, potentially how someone deals with those stresses, and there's kind of lots of different points where they're eating well or not eating well, becomes very, very key in what the outcome is, if they're sleeping well or not sleeping well, all of these things that might, even digestion, whether that's kind of, optimal where it should be, can have an effect.
Mm. Because that all influences the hormones. And what we're really saying here is the underlying condition is some disruption in the hormones, whether it's the excess adrenaline, the low thyroid. I say potentially estrogen because there seems to be a lot of talk on that now, a lot of pushback that estrogen is not a factor in cancer. So there's confusion there on that. But when we're talking about all these different stressors, it's not stress in the context of just the woo-woo, the emotional aspect that many people would consider stress to be. We're talking like this actually has a biochemical reaction. And if we're constantly in this state or we've had this traumatic experience, it is triggering this reaction and we're either staying there or we're not metabolizing adrenaline properly or whatever it is.
Yeah,
Uh,
totally.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the interesting things that comes up from an environmental perspective, there's some really interesting studies on how much, so in like environments like play environments, soft play, or the things where you have like the trampolines and the soft play areas that you can bounce into. There was a study in Australia that suggested that even toddlers were ingesting grams of plastic per year, which are a combination of kind of flame retardants and plastics, whether that you just wouldn't expect to be there. Well, not to inspect there, but that amount of we're talking grams, but over the year, that becomes a sizable load from like an endocrine disrupting perspective, which might facilitate, the estrogen receptors and the estrogen action, more importantly, being upregulated, plus, having the thyroid suppressive effects. So I think there becomes many things in the environment that can cause this decrease in robustness or inability to be able to respond to what the environment's throwing at you. So, you couple that with all this, whether it's the emotional stress or the physical or the chemical stresses that they've been experiencing in younger life, which could be starting, in kindergarten or in preschool because they're in all these soft play areas. So it becomes an accumulation. And unfortunately, a lot of these compounds they accumulate. They're lipophilic, so they're fat loving, and they'll kind of get stuck in fat tissues and often not metabolized and sent out of the system. So it becomes, I guess, quite hard sometimes to get to the etiology of it's often for a lot of people who've got cancer. And as I said, I don't actually work with anyone with cancer. Yeah, it becomes that's kind of shutting the barn gate after the horse is bolted, really, isn't it? But you can do plenty of things after that from a lifestyle and environmental perspective to perhaps prevent it coming back and making sure you're staying in remission.
You mentioned, Keith, there the toxic load in fat cells. So, I mean, just to put this very simply, would an approach then be to reduce body fat to help decrease that toxic load to hopefully stack conditions in your favor when we're looking at cancer outcomes?
Well, I think it certainly makes a lot of sense, and most people are on board with the idea that having no more than a moderate amount of abdominal fat is probably a useful place to be, and certainly the more weight that you gain can leave you. I mean, it might be from an excess amount of calories, it might be from a combination of emotional stress, physical stress, and all of these other things. Perhaps under exercising, it becomes problematic to be able to dial it into one specific thing. But we do know that the more adipose tissue that you take on does become a burden. We see more increases in, say, C-reactive protein. We might see an inability to metabolize glucose efficiently. This is where we might see issues with blood sugars, and people start blaming the whole idea on obesity that it's a sugar-related issue. But yet we know that there are many problems related with why sugar isn't being metabolized that's often lost on a lot of people.
And then right now, we do have, I mean, like you said, there's everything outside of our controls. It's well and good talking about stress, Alannah, as we'll bring you in a minute. It's well and good talking about stress, but there's a lot people cannot control. There's a lot of work stress, PhD stress, environmental toxins that we're getting exposed to. There's a lot we can't control. But in the context of adipose tissue or body fat, for a lot of us, we can control an element of that. So reducing that and addressing metabolic issues is in our control, which is a way to stack conditions in our favor. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Because if you look at, say, even accumulation of, say, the bisphenols as an example, BPA, the newer bisphenols S and F, which have been replacing the kind of banned ones, and we're seeing this in many different chemical domains, is that they can accumulate, but to the extent that you exercise or sweat, use saunas, you can actually reduce those loads quite substantially. So there are many things that you can do in your favor. Even being conscious of what's going on in the home. So we see many flame retardants in many sofas or carpets or things like that. To the extent that you can control some of those things, you can make lifestyle choices. it's right that I think a large amount of the population tend to be fairly, I don't want to use that word ignorant, but just unaware of these things because, a lot of these chemicals have been put into the environment for decades and decades, and then they find something is actually really quite nefarious. And, something like a bisphenol A or whether it's a brominated flame retardant like a BDE, both have been shown to cause cancer and decrease fertility and all of the other things associated with it. So then the manufacturers come along with another one that's touted as safe. But then when you start investigating the safe, which is what we found in the lab as well, is actually they have a very similar action to the last one, but they just haven't been investigated yet to actually show that the effects are quite detrimental. So it is a game that you have to be aware of to be on top of those things, I think. But again, it's also a game that you don't want to be. There's a continuum between playing the game and being on top of stuff to being totally obsessed about stuff, and it's saying somewhere in the middle. I think that's good for emotional health.
Yeah, sometimes it can be too much, too overwhelming. And when it's too overwhelming, what do people do? They do nothing. They just throw in the towel.
Mm.
Yeah.
Alannah, you have your new book on cancer coming out. Do you have an aspect of body fat or weight loss in the book in regards to cancer?
Yeah, we do. I mean, I think fat is a living, breathing organ. It's not an idle, passive, like people kind of think it's just like there, but I think it's an endocrine tissue, but it's not only that, it's also I think also a protection mechanism. A lot of times the body will sequester like, tissue. Even that's why, sequesters estrogen, so it's not like in the bloodstream. And so a lot of the times it's usually doing something to help you. Like the body's always trying to help you. And so sometimes people think it's always like a bad thing that you have fat, but a lot of times it's trying to protect you. Just like how like DHA in the brain accumulates so it doesn't get used. Sometimes you don't want to use the things in your tissue, so it doesn't allow for that. It just holds it there, which can be really good. Problem is when it starts, like cortisol will break into the tissue or, like androgens start aromatizing and then it starts entering the blood and you're like, where are these symptoms coming from? It's like, well,
Then
maybe.
there's those unseen endotoxins that Keith's referring to, is there's your body's trying to protect you, but there's so much burden, it just can't keep up.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's usually the body's I mean even cancer, right? It's just a response that's trying to, help you. It's a like cancer is a normal response that happens when the body's trying to repair. Increased glycolysis, all of these things are generally nothing to be disappointed about.
What do you think? This is always on my mind, and I've mentioned it a few times in the podcast, and I'm like, I can say whatever I want. This is my podcast.
Yeah.
Um, this whole like push on plus size models and embrace your body, and no matter 200, 300, 400 pounds, like you can be healthy at 300. All this, Keith, I don't know how prominent it is in Ireland and England, but Canada and the US is a bit out of control, and I think it's highly problematic. Like, no, I'm not saying don't love yourself, of course love yourself,
Yeah.
but we're lying to people telling them just embrace the 300, 400 pound aspect of your life.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think also the problem is the type of storage is more PUFA now, whereas like historically it was more saturated fat. And so maybe that would have been less of a burden on the body, but the more PUFA storage you have, the more it's going to get into the blood at some point when like you trigger lipolysis or something. So the problem is really the type of storage, I think. And then I mean, yeah, the more fat cells you have in your body, the more potential for estrogen to be made since every, fat cell make estrogen. So the lower surface area you have of that, the less risk of you being, carrying more estrogen on your body is going
Mm.
to be an issue, you
It
know?
is that risk that people don't consider as well. Like fat cells, they're highly inflammatory. They store heavy metals, they store pesticides, herbicides. It's not just a storage site for fat and self-love. It's highly problematic, and we are misleading people down a pathway that could be very dangerous if we're not seeing it right now, potentially in the next 10 to 20 years. Because we've really only been seeing this, since the COVID era, where when that kind of fell through a hole, then all of a sudden it was embrace whatever you look like, kind of.
Yeah. Society is kind of backwards most of the time.
Misleading, yeah. Keith, what's it like over there in the UK? Do they have a push for the whole embrace? I mean, how do you even word it? Of course, you love yourself, but there's an element where there's a line we shouldn't cross when we're looking at health.
I think you see in the advertising, it tends to be a bit more inclusive these days. You're not just seeing kind of models, you're seeing kind of women of all different sizes, which I think is a great idea because of the norms that exist these days. And unfortunately, we are seeing kind of more inheritable traits coupled with environmental stuff where people are being born with much higher kind of capacity to store fats, and that might be coming from the environment, might be coming from prenatal nutrition, it might be coming from a variety of things. But I think the problem is, like you say, and digressing slightly, is that you're not seeing like a lot of these people getting fatter because they're consuming large amounts of saturated fats. It is because there's a lot more polyunsaturated fats in the diet. And that creates, as you say, it's an inflammasome itself. And the problem is that cancer, well, cancer can exist because of these unsaturated fats that are ubiquitous. And even cancer, as a rule, doesn't like unsaturated fats. It will use them as a fuel, but actually, it will try and get them out of the. It will actually try and put more saturated fats within around the membrane to make them more stable. Because if you soak the cells with unsaturated fats, particularly the longer chain fatty acids, they become really problematic and actually can damage cancer cells. And that's why cancer cells are actually they use DHA as a combination therapy with chemo because DHA makes them so leaky. Chemotherapy can go in and make them even more unstable, and so have a better effect. We have gotten away from kind of what is a healthy looking body. Not to say that people should be um, forced to think that there is only one way to look. There are lots of different physiques and types, but we know that the more body fat that you accumulate over time, then that can be problematic and lead to many different diseases, whether it's heart disease, cancer, any of the things that we might see. But I think it's there is a lot more in advertising. I don't think it's rammed down anybody's throat, but you just tend to see a lot more extremes on social media about what is supposedly healthy and what's not.
Yeah. Excuse me. Over here is a little bit different than Europe. Definitely does get rammed down your throat here. It does for sure. Um, but what you said there, PUFAs being fuel for cancer, which is very important information for our listeners to hear. Like if you are unfortunately someone who is dealing with cancer now or potentially in the future, you don't want to be adding fuel to the fire there. Maybe now is the time to turn the table, for lack of a better word, on your nutritional approach.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Talking about the amount of polyunsaturated fat, what's well known within cancer physiology is that de novo fat synthesis is increased in cancers because it will use them as a fuel, but structurally it will want to make sure there's more saturated fat. So it will try and burn or get rid of the fat, the unsaturated fatty acids to use as fuel because it would create so much structural damage to cancer cells. And a lot of the enzymes, such as I think there's an enzyme called acetyl CoA carboxylase, which is dramatically increased in cancers. And you also see the desaturase, the long enzyme desaturases, they're dramatically increased in quite a lot of cancers as well, including breast cancer, that you see that the amount of PUFA can be, it's not causative, but it's certainly there's a strong association between the amount of fat in these tissues and the etiology of cancer.
Mm. Alannah,
Mhm.
do you discuss PUFAs much in your book? Like, would that be one of the foundational
Oh yeah.
concepts? I would
That's
assume because of Ray P did is one of the keys.
It's probably the largest section in the book. I mean, people hate when we talk about PUFA online because they are so ingrained that this is good for them. Even the nuts and the seeds and stuff. And it's almost hard to like talk about it. They're like this couldn't be true because of the ketogenic diet wars, and they love keto and stuff. And I was keto like when it was first coming out. And so I'm like, we're post chemo, guys. We're post keto. We're just thinking about the mechanisms here. So but yeah, it's a big section, mostly because not so much on like the eating. Okay, so basically like PUFAs are very unstable. When they oxidize, they can bind to an enzyme called PDH, which is needed to fulfill glucose oxidate, like for, to make sugar, to make energy from sugar. And so the problem really is like fat upregulating the cancer metabolism, which is hyperglycolysis. So it's kind of, we hope to make it really clear because I think these concepts are very, very confusing. But basically, when you are oxidizing fat, like PUFA, you're creating aldehydes that bind to an enzyme that is really needed for you to oxidize sugar. So if you are binding to it, sugar oxidation doesn't have that enzyme, PDH, so it can't fulfill it. And then you're stuck with, cancer cells that are stalled.
What you're saying here, you're literally saying, and to get granular, you're obviously talking about PUFAs, but the average person
Yeah.
is going to hear you say burning fat fuels cancer. Hold on. I thought sugar causes cancer because isn't that what we've heard so much over the last decade? No, it's
Mhm.
sugar that causes cancer. And that
Yeah.
kind of was what brought, I suppose, the whole ketogenic diet to light, apart from the weight loss aspect, was, oh my God, if I follow this diet, I can prevent cancer.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's what they think. I mean, I think I think there's this like famous line that's like you can't understand biology without looking at evolution. And once you tell people that like our bodies have always burned sugar, in fact, we've been burning sugar for 1 billion years longer than we ever had fat metabolism. Like ancient organisms could not burn fat. They had to burn sugar. They only could burn sugar. And so that's actually why like parts of our body can only burn sugar, like some they don't even have mitochondria, so they can't burn fat. Fat metabolism happens in the mitochondria. So you like they physically cannot burn fat. I try to tell people that. I'm like, I mean they can't burn, yeah, they can't do it. Like your body can't do it. So I have to like tell them this from a point of evolution is like we've just had a lot more time burning sugar, so the process is very good. It's a very efficient process. We had a
Mm.
billion more years to perfect it. So it's funny, it's the same people that say like eat like your ancestors. I'm like ancient bacteria or ancient ancestors, they perform sugar, not fat.
Yeah.
They so I try
But
to
that's the thing, isn't it? It's like everybody who kind of says, "Oh, well, sugar feeds cancer." It's like, well, cancer will feed off whatever it's available. So if
yeah.
sugar's not there, it will aggressively metabolize amino acids um, and lipids. And to the extent that you restrict sugar, it can make them aggressively burn these even more. I think glutamine is obviously a key thing because we know that glutamine is. And what I find quite interesting, Thomas Seyfried, who's kind of
Yeah.
he very much promotes the low glucose, low glutamine
Yeah.
diet for reversing. I often look at some of the case studies and they're very limited
Yeah. We're like
because,
16 people in the group. And I'm
yeah,
like, okay.
exactly. And I mean, it's like, okay, well, some people went on a ketogenic diet, some people didn't change their diet at all. Well, the people who went on the ketogenic had some success, but they weren't all successful. And people that didn't change their diet, well, if they're not changing the diet and they're kind of having some, foods that cause inflammation and cause problem and restrict the ability to burn glucose as fuel, there are going to be problems. So there are, and I understand that the problems of getting these numbers as well is trying to get people to commit to these studies is quite difficult anyway. But at the same time, it's like when you say to somebody who's a low carb advocate, it's like when they say your body makes its own sugar, it doesn't need any more. It's like that is they say the default mechanism is ketosis.
Yeah.
It's not. It's the
Yeah.
ability to burn glucose efficiently as a fuel, which creates
Right.
more carbon dioxide, which has a capacity to promote optimal oxidative metabolism. And like we said, it's that loss of oxidative metabolism falling back on glycolysis and the Wahlberg effect that you mentioned that causes the problems, and we know that's upregulated in cancer. So it's often I've stopped engaging people on social media about why glucose is more protective than fats. It's just not worth it.
Right. It's actually like, yeah, it's kind of complicated. You have to be willing to like learn about all the pathways. But I think the ketogenic benefits are from doing more saturated fat than like maybe historically eating more of the seed oils and then moving to the saturated fat, like
Yeah.
possibly. And then from eating more protein, maybe they were like on a low protein, they needed a little bit more protein or something. I don't
Yeah.
know. That's what I'm thinking is when people say they feel better, it's from those two things. And then
Yeah.
ketones are like GABA agonists. So I think those are maybe the three benefits from the ketogenic.
Yeah, or maybe even something like if you're consuming a diet that's high in refined grains, that's perhaps kind of tainted with a mycotoxin like zearalenone, which is well documented causing many, many issues. If you restrict those kind of foods, and I like to say it's kind of with anyone, it's this kind of zone of dogma formation. It's where you literally change one diet, and for about 3 or 4 months, you're waxing lyrical about it. But then, 6 months or a year down the line, things start to go south again. And it's like understanding what's going on with that. It's like it's not everyone will get short-term gains from switching the diet, whether you go high meat eating to low meat eating, really high carb eating to less carb eating. There are changes to be had in the short term from everybody.
I think a lot of people as well underestimate how shitty their diet is in the first place. So then they're not only eliminating excess PUFAs and grains, but then you've got all the other additives, the food coloring, the form that they're cooking in as well. They're being a little bit more mindful about what they're eating. And I see this all the time because I do consultations that last for up to 2 hours. And people don't realize how bad they eat until they have to fully be transparent and open up. And if you're eliminating all of that stuff, of course, you're going to feel better for a time frame on keto or carnivore, but that doesn't mean it's the long-term solution. It actually seems to be more problematic in the long term.
So
Uh,
true.
yeah, I agree.
Keith, if someone, and Alana, I'll put the same to you, but I think you already answered it. Because you mentioned the social media aspect, Keith. I try to, just walk away, just scroll on. But every once in a while, you get sucked into the rabbit hole where someone will say, um, this literally came up on a post recently about cancer, and someone says, well, we know sugar feeds cancer, so you need to eliminate sugar. And then someone else said, I said, well, actually, there's no solid evidence that that is the case. And then someone else said, but we've always been told it's sugar that causes cancer. What would you say to someone? I know you don't want to get into the argument, but if it was like just your average person, they're probably not going to understand the science aspect of it. How would you respond to them?
Well, I'll jump in first. It's the same mechanism why people blame diabetes on sugar. Is because they're looking at a pathway that looks at a substrate not being metabolized and the blood test showing that. Which is like that. It's like you're looking at that without understanding all of the other things that surround that. And that's why you see loads of, you can use the phrase ketards, I guess. It's like literally, it's somebody I've been on a ketogenic diet now and I reversed my type 2 to be diabetes. But when I start eating sugar again, it comes back. Well, you haven't reversed anything. All you've done is remove something that's not working very, very well, and you haven't addressed that mechanism. So when they start to look at the, glucose in the blood, the homeostatic mechanism of insulin resistance, where they're looking at HbA1c, all of these mechanisms, it's like if you haven't addressed that mechanism, it's always going to look shitty in the end. It's just not going to happen. So what they do, they're not really prepared to go and address that mechanism. All they keep doing is just saying sugar causes this, because when I start eating it again, this is what happens. And it's like, well, that's reductionism in itself. And that's why everybody seems to think that having a sugar, a low carbohydrate diet is the answer to anything. Well, it's not if you can't start consuming it, and then all your problems come back, which I find utterly it's reductionist in a can, to be honest.
Not
Yeah.
sustainable. Alana, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've always said like repeat will never actually go really mainstream because there's no tribe that actually thinks sugar is good for you. Everyone agrees that sugar is not only evil, it's like the cause of all your problems in life. You might get divorced because of sugar. You might not get your PhD because of sugar. Like literally, there's nothing
Why I'm not a
everyone
millionaire, it's all sugar's fault.
sugar. Everyone agrees that sugar is the root of everyone's problems, right? So like it's so deeply like a lot of our eating ideas are so societally ingrained. It's like impossible to even have these honest conversations. But it's just like, like Keith said, it's like having a sink that's broken. If you don't want to run water through it, then I guess that's fine, but it just means you can't oxidize the sugar. So that's why when you run water again through it, you can't, like, your blood sugar goes up, you have those spikes because you haven't fixed that the sink is actually broken. So, yeah, but no one really wants to talk about that. Like, all major diseases are from specifically not being able to oxidize sugar. Like, you cannot oxidize it. That's why you have cancer. That is the prime cause. You have oxygen interruption to the cell. You don't have the oxygen to carry the sugar through the entire process of cellular respiration. So until like people want to have that conversation, it's just really hard to even get anywhere. But I mean, I also like to bring up, I'm like, so if we are not meant to eat sugar, why can we taste sugar? There's plenty of animals that cannot taste sugar on their tongue. So why do you think we have that ability? Is it just like nothing in the body is random? Like we have a gallbladder for a reason. We have tonsils for a reason. Why can we taste sugar? A lot of animals just can't. You think it's there for fun or like for random little events? It's there because that's always been there. Our body has always burned sugar before fat.
Well, that's
You
back
know?
to what Keith said, that if why can we make our own sugar if we're not consuming sugar? Because the body needs sugar. If it didn't need sugar, we wouldn't have the ability to make our own sugar.
People can't get their head around that. They have that statement, the body makes its own sugar, and that's enough for them. Instead of
Yeah.
going, why do we have the capacity to fall back to make our own sugar, which usually involves breaking down our own tissue? Sure,
Yeah.
we can have an excess of fatty acids that can be used. That no doubt about that. But in some cases, you'll see a lot of these diets where they say, "I've got so much weight loss." Yeah, but part of that is losing part of your lean muscle tissue, and people don't realize that. And also, when you lose part of your lean muscle tissue, it means that you don't have the capacity to perhaps engage with a higher calorific diet as well. But everyone just stops to that. Your body makes its own sugar, gluconeogenesis. It's not a primary mechanism. It's part of that mechanism that makes you more robust to go through different times, to deal with different stressors, including malnutrition, including not getting enough calories in, including times when you haven't got enough sugar in. But to say that it's a default mechanism that you need to rely on is where the problems start to occur. But again, it becomes, as I said, reductionist in a sense that you're not entertaining the fact that sugar is not being burned because of all these other mechanisms around it.
There's a lot of confusion out there, and especially with the movement of the keytards, as you say, Keith. But there was a lot of push, especially around ketones for brain health, and trying to convince my people, my clients, will know your brain prefers to burn glucose as its primary fuel, not ketones. And that's why we restore glycogen stores during sleep in our brain. But we've been had the idea pushed on us so much for the last few years that no, ketones are good for your brain. And I'm not arguing that they can't have their benefits, but it doesn't mean they're our primary or preferred fuel source of the brain.
Yeah.
Uh,
Like what I mean, what Keith says, the carbon dioxide just is the biggest issue, honestly, with burning the fat because you're not like, so when you're burning sugar, like a cancer cell, you're converting most of it to lactate. So, and when you're burning sugar efficiently, you're making carbon dioxide. So that's a problem because carbon dioxide releases oxygen to the tissue. And without oxygen released, that is the prime cause of cancer. That was Warburg's theory, that oxygen interruption to the cell is the cause of cancer. So anything that interrupts oxygen interruption to the cell is a carcinogen, anything that messes with the process. And so the big problem with burning fat more than sugar is you're not making as much CO2. Um, so you don't have that really beautiful process of releasing oxygen to the tissues. So when people say like cancer loves sugar, they do love sugar, they're just not using it. They are not fulfilling, they're not getting that potential out of the sugar. They're just wasting it all to lactate, pretty much. I mean, not all of it, but most of it goes just to lactate.
mm,
Most of the time the body makes lactate, it's not a bad thing. It recycles it through the Cori cycle. like there's mechanisms for handling lactate. It's not like lactate's totally, we're always, making lactate. It's just that the body has a way of dealing with it, but with cancer, it's overwhelmed with the lactate production. So,
What I
What?
always found interesting about the Warburg stuff as well is that it's interesting how he also cited that riboflavin deficiency as well as being
yeah.
part of that, and that has been shown, and I think that's getting more play now. What I
Yeah.
find quite interesting from my area of research is how during hypothyroidism, as an example, two key points is one is that riboflavin enzyme is actually significantly reduced in hypothyroidism. So
Mm.
this inability to go through the electron transport chain at that particular point might be a key player related to thyroid. And the other idea is that with insulin resistance, even TSH levels around about 1 to 2 are associated with insulin resistance in that normal
Mm.
range. So I think this is where thyroid has a really significant play around perhaps the progression to cancer through interrupting the electron transport chain, and also the fact that TSH is inflammatory even at relatively supposed normal ranges within that thyroid realm, or what is normal for everybody. Oh, I've come back, my thyroid blood tests are completely normal. Of course they are.
Mm. Yeah, so
What
true.
you're alluding to, Keith, and what you alluded to, Alannah, for people who don't get the words, because a lot of people don't, that oxidative stress. This is metabolic dysfunction. This basically is a signal your metabolism, right down on a cellular level, is not working correctly. And Keith, that's what you just mentioned there with hypothyroidism, is that lower, not optimal thyroid function.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think that's a key part of it. I think, and you see, I mean, if you look at even some of the historical perspectives, there's a really interesting paper, I think, I think it's late 1800s or early 1900s on the first use of thyroid hormone to reverse breast cancer. And it
Mm.
was working in a lot of people, but there were some cases, I think Beatson was the researcher, and it showed that post-surgery, there was such a rather large, tumor within the breast. It just kept coming back. But when he took it out and then gave thyroid hormone, particularly obviously the T3 acting as this kind of thyroid hormone actually help to reverse breast cancer. And I think it becomes obviously problematic to begin lots of different things. I don't think breast cancer is just because of low T3. I think
Yeah.
it can be a considerable player, but we know there are other things, perhaps burden of environmental pollutants or excess estrogens or low progesterone that might be causing that. But I do think the thyroid. I mean, obviously that's my bias, but I still think that there's a significant part to play. And we know that estradiol suppresses thyroid hormone conversion. We know that there are a number of environmental pollutants that act like estrogens that suppress thyroid. This plays into not being able to use sugar again. This plays into normal tissue differentiation not occurring. So yeah, I do think that is significant. But I would say that because I'm a thyroid researcher at the moment. So
It
Yeah, no.
didn't, Keith, haven't you done in the lab some cell lines using specifically T3 on cancer cells, and you saw improvement, if not regression there?
within a U87 glioblastoma cell line, which is a human line, I did find a certain dose of T3 decreased the amount of expression, which does a proliferation within a glioblastoma cell line. Now the thing is that within a cancer cell line and within normal tissue, thyroid hormone is proliferative. So we do see these normal responses. Within the GH3 cell line, which is a rat pituitary cell line that I'm looking at, the pituitary tumor cell line, is that we can use T3 to see if it has a normal proliferative response. Now, what I'm finding is certain endocrine disruptors, particularly thyroid disruptors, flame retardants in particular, tend to decrease the effects of thyroid hormone. But when you add T3 to it, it actually rescues what's going on. So I think this is where we can make some inference that actually having an adequate amount of T3 is very useful to kind of offset the effects of endocrine disruptors. I think the problem is that T4 can become quite problematic, is that if there's a TSH is churning out T4 all the time and the T3 is not being converted, there are some non-genomic pathways which mean they don't act at the level of the thyroid receptor. They act at a membrane receptor that cause more proliferation. And this is why perhaps an increase in TSH plus T4 and an inadequate conversion to T3 can actually cause the potential cancer excess because there's more proliferation. And when you lump in the fact that the estrogen receptor as well can be associated with increased proliferation, this increased T4, increased estradiol can cause quite a lot of problems. But it certainly seems that when you add T3 to the mix, it does at certain doses. There's quite a few different doses that respond in different ways, but certainly in physiological and supraphysiological levels, when you add T3, it tends to rescue the effect of the thyroid suppression.
Yeah, and when you think about like people don't know that a tadpole turning into a frog completely rests on T3. Like an entire amphibian growing up is all on T3 because it's a morphogen, which is like it's I love this idea because cells have identities, and how do they know who they are? Like just like a society, someone grows up to be a baker or a policeman. Cells are the same way. They have this identity, and the T3 is exactly what gives them their cellular fate of who they're going to be in the society of your body. So even though you kind of think of this like a dark system inside of us, it's actually a fully grown society. And it's that T3 molecule that literally says, you're going to be the baker of this town, like you're going to be the policeman, you're going to be the lawyer.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so important in cancer, because cancer is formless, directionless. You don't have people growing up into who they're supposed to be. And T3 is like what helps them grow up into something functional. So I don't know. There's so many metaphors for life with T3. I love that hormone.
Yes, you're a lot better at analogizing than I am and put it into a much more packaged sentence, I think. So that's useful having you.
Yeah, am I
Yeah.
correct though as well? Because I've heard Carol Peterson discuss using T4 alone can be hyperinflammatory in itself, and it can downregulate the deiodinase enzymes and at the liver level, and further downgrade ability for conversion into T3 in itself, which is contradictory to what people think, because we're generally prescribed by conventional medicine just T4, which I had one client say that every time she takes T4, her hair falls out, but she
Hmm.
needs T4 to keep her TSH in the range her doctor likes to see it. So when I heard Carol mention the downregulation of the deiodinase enzyme, I was like, well, yeah, no wonder your hair is falling out then. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, what I find interesting, and you probably might have seen this too, Alana, is that there's a school of research, I think it's called Davis, that was suggesting that cancer cells, I think particularly thyroid cancer cells, have become autonomous to TSH and T4. So what they were
Hmm.
suggesting, they were making people hypothyroid by just giving them they're making them hypothyroid by giving them the methylmiazole, which is the kind of thyroid suppressing drug, but giving them T3. So technically, they're not, and this is to suppress cancer through TSH suppression. So that they keep the T3 high, but they're calling them hypothyroid, which I think is a bit of a misnomer, because if you're giving someone adequate T3, they're actually not. They're not hypothyroid anymore. They have
Hmm.
adequate thyroid hormone circulating. But yeah, I think that because T4 does have it has some pro-angiogenic pathways. It has some vascular endothelial growth factor pathways. I think when that becomes dysregulated, that gives more opportunity for tissues to become dysregulated and lead to that cancer outcomes. And that might play havoc with that the metabolism of hair follicles as well.
Mhm. And TSH in itself, being a pituitary signaling factor, is inflammatory, yet we're always trying to see TSH in a certain range. And some doctors will purposely go out of their way to increase a patient's TSH to make sure it's in that range. To us, it might be perfectly normal at, say, 0.5 or 0.8, but to your average conventional doctor, oh my God, you're hyperthyroid. Let's increase your TSH, and therefore exacerbating inflammation to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, never underestimate the red mark, the red range. You've gone into the red range. We have to get you back out of the red range, and that just exists because that's the algorithm for the treatment or for the medical system and for the healthcare and insurance system at large. But it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, I see plenty of people with whose you see some people whose TSH is undetectable, and I think Paul Robinson's work. He's kind of like the idea that keeping the pituitary suppressed can actually be quite a beneficial thing, and that certainly goes back to decades old research on pituitary suppression, where the pituitary hormones are technically hormones of aging.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so glad you're doing research on this, Keith, because like there's actually not that much research on thyroid hormones and breast cancer like in PubMed. I we look all the time with my research team and it's one of those things you just don't there's just not so much literature on, or it's backwards. It's like if you take T3 you're gonna get cancer. It's like no. I think it's one of those murky areas because the conversion of T4 to T3, that's not something we can like easily see on a blood test. Like we don't actually know like if you're converting optimally, we can guess, but like adrenaline suppresses the conversion from T4 to T3. So is it a thyroid problem or are you just stressed all the time so you're not converting, T4 to T3, the active hormone? And so I think those layers just mean it's complicated with thyroid hormones when you're like dosing it and trying to fix it and stuff.
But also the idea is a bit like the estrogen blood test, right? It's like that where that that's not reflective of what's going in the cell. There is more thyroid intracellularly than there is in the serum.
Yeah.
So we know that there's going to be way more T3 available within the cell. So again, if you're seeing issues with transporters, whether it's MC, oh God, is it MCT8 and 10? If we're seeing issues to say transthyretin in the brain, if any of these are hijacked by any of the potential endocrine disruptors, or even fatty acids as an example, which can
Yeah.
hijack the transporters, then you have no idea on what the serum test is doing, and that's why you will see time after time people going, "Blood doctor, tell me the blood tests are absolutely fine." But they're not. I don't. I feel terrible. I mean, that's just there. That will be there till the end of time, I think.
I think you're right.
Alana, you probably are aware of Dr. Alan Christensen. Keith, I don't know if you've heard of him. So he's been an endocrinologist specializing in thyroid function for, I believe, 3 decades. I recently heard him say on Dr. Mercola's podcast that at this stage he believes that testing thyroid through serum is pointless, and the only test he believes to have of any value at all, apart from doing aspiration or ultrasound, would be just the TPOs. That TPO, and even then, he also said, which was quite confusing, that even if it looks like someone has no elevated TPOs, it still doesn't mean they have a thyroid issue. Like they don't have a thyroid issue.
Yeah. I mean, the thyroid peroxidases and the anti-TPOs, I think that you can, to the extent of how much damage is going on within the thyroid, can be dictated by many things. And then it's sometimes the ability to mount the immune response. I mean, if you look at Jamie Cunliffe's work, which is who Ray talked about quite a lot, is the idea that we're potentially producing antibodies because we're actually just dismantling damaged tissue, which
Yeah.
can be a reasonably good marker. But at the same time, sometimes just because you're not producing that doesn't mean that response is not occurring, or that you're perhaps not even able to mount that response sometimes, depending on how the immune system chooses to see either the damage or the ability to mount that response.
Yeah, Rapey has that great article that's like antibodies are way more confusing than you think. A lot of times they're high because of like, I think he says, I want to say it's like knee damage or something. Like sometimes your knee is damaged, so you're or something like that. I need to go back. I haven't read it in a while, but it kind of always goes back to the idea that like that tweet that's like, uh, you think a computer is complicated. It's primitive compared to the human body. Like a computer is primitive compared to the millions of pathways that are going on. So, um, that's why we need doctors to be a little bit more nimble, I think, on these like blood test is this way, like what about how the person feels? What about trying something and experimenting with something because it's not always like this black and white system going on.
Yeah, and I think that's why kind of Ray talks about even Illich a lot, because Illich was, whether it's kind of the way that you're schooled. It's like we're kind of losing the capacity, or we're losing this vernacular of all the stuff that's gone before us in supposedly in favor of stuff that's more beneficial, but the end of the day, we're just being taught things that benefit business more than the ability to think about things. And to be honest, that's the medical system in itself, isn't it? It's a business that's designed as a structure to create more money and not necessarily to make people better.
It's a
Yeah, I was just reading kind of in that vein that autopsies when people die have dropped like 59%. And I think it goes back to this idea that we're no longer sort of like learning and evaluating from like why someone died. It's kind of like, okay, they died, let's move on. And it's actually, I think it's very symbolic that we no longer are like evaluating our errors in how we treated someone or evaluating really why did someone die. Like people just the drop in autopsies is crazy. Like no one does autopsies as much anymore. Um, and so, we can't even teach doctors maybe, you did the diagnosis wrong. Maybe you did the treatment wrong. We can't learn from these things. We're just like they now like outsource, it to like investigations to like a legal team, usually these days at the hospitals. But it used to be an essential tool for understanding someone's human body. But
Yeah,
yeah.
and the thing is that all that end up being farmed out as big data. So they'd just be looking at, say, a cause of death that might have actually just been written down rather than
Yeah.
actually pathologized and actually, a proper autopsy being done. So then the data actually becomes fairly flawed anyway because of the way that
You
the
think?
data's being
Okay.
collected. So yeah, then we end up having more treatments that are based upon faulty data. So it's a bit of a catch-22, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
It would make you wonder as well if there's an element of care there where we've just stopped caring what the cause was and we're
Mm.
just continuing to transition more into just the health industry being a big financial market. We don't really care how can we make our money. Kind of like what
Yeah, I
happened
agree.
with
I
COVID.
agree. It's symbolic. It's symbolic. We're distancing ourselves from hands-on mortality, and we're kind of separating ourselves from the like even truth of life, you know? And so I agree. It's more symbolic than anything.
And
Which
the general public doesn't care about that either, right? So, like, if you use COVID as an example, I'm interested. No, look, there's quite a few papers that show that actually low thyroid, you're going to suffer worse, or low progesterone, or low vitamin D. And the general public no, it's just COVID. It's really bad. We need a vaccine to prevent it. And it's like, okay, okay.
Yeah.
is that an element though of ignorance? People just don't want to know, or is it a form of conditioning? I mean, the mind does boggle on how some people think about certain topics.
Well, people don't like complexity for sure. I mean that nobody likes to get in understanding because sometimes like you get more information, you become more confused about a subject,
Yeah.
which is understandable, but it's still grabbing the reins and trying to at least make some gains into it. I think from society as well is like some people have too much to lose. So people will go along with stuff because they know that they will lose stuff. So they're literally like, so I have some friends in Dubai who are living there. They actively took the vaccines because they knew they wouldn't be able to travel. They said we know we probably don't agree with it, but we just want to be able to travel still. And it's like, people will take that because they don't like pushing back. And so I think you get a large element of society that don't want to lose stuff, so they don't push back. They just go with the flow.
I think that when we were discussing keto earlier, I think that's also an element. It's easier to just eliminate and do keto, be the reductionist, and take away the carbs than it is to actually learn and understand your metabolic system and how to fix it.
I think too, like there's generally a sort of logical argument in these things. Like we treat cancer, like we eradicate the cancer, right? Like that kind of makes sense. But then when you go deeper into it, you're like, wait. There's a lot of things that don't really make sense. So I think it's generally art or like rooted in things that make sense. They just kind of more surface level. So you're like, okay, yeah, it makes sense. Stop eating sugar, I have lower blood sugar. And then you're like, whoa, there's a whole world beneath this that's actually a lot more complicated and nuanced. So There's layers to it. I feel so lucky that we have been given, for whatever reason, a drive to look deeper. It's such a privilege. I just feel so lucky every day that for some reason we were given that chance to look deeper into the body. And then you get into it and you're like, oh my God, you can't even make it's so much more complicated than you could ever imagine.
Yeah, what did I get myself into?
Yeah. But I think it's when because we get that comment every day. I'm more confused. And I'm like, you just started learning about this. When were you ever did you think that like you started learning about this like a month ago? You're like suddenly it's all gonna make sense. Like the body's been developing for billions of years. You just got in here. Like, isn't that a normal first step of learning anything? Being confused. I feel like that's an invitation, not something to get mad at me for, you know?
And also understanding you don't need to understand it to the level that we might understand it. You just need to have a basic understanding of metabolism and what to do about it.
Yeah, which is what we try to give people every day for free, you know, like some things to nibble on every single day, things to live a better life. And I feel like such a duty to putting these terms in a little bit more layman so people can understand them and feel better. Yeah.
Before I want to ask you both one more question before we start to wrap up. Where do you think, because progesterone being both of your lines of expertise, where do you think progesterone plays a part in the cancer theory? Because I know there are a lot of doctors. Now, Dr. David Rosensweet, who you know, Alannah, um, he is coming back on the podcast to discuss his opinion on hormones and cancer in a few weeks. And his opinion is different to your opinion. So it's interesting to hear the different sides. But I think everyone agrees that progesterone plays a valuable part here, if not in the metabolic aspect and reducing the stress response aspect, it maybe has a deeper implication in helping.
Yeah, one of the things I think about every day is how much of a no-brainer it is to use high-dose progesterone like instead of tamoxifen, which I can't even really like say because it's so against the standard of care. Because I was talking to my mom, I'm like, you know, tamoxifen can be estrogenic, right? Like she knows all this stuff, like, and it can be very painful for a woman to and like for those that you know don't know, there's estrogen blockers which bind to the estrogen receptor, and then there's aromatase inhibitors which block the conversion of androgens to estrogen. So there's kind of two classes there. They are a huge industry, $15 billion industry, like massive, projected to double like in the next few years. And so they do work in a sense, but I think there's so much better things that can work. And one of those things that could work so much better, in my opinion, is high dose progesterone. But people comment every day, what's something I can take instead of estrogen blockers? And I'm like, well, maybe one of the most obvious anti-estrogens is progesterone. Um, you know, you could explore that, and I try to kind of hint at it, maybe something you could look into on your own because you know, progesterone decomposes the estrogen receptor, whereas tamoxifen has all these side effects of it's really painful. If you talk to a woman on you know, any kind of estrogen blocker. It's so painful. And to the point where a lot of them just deny it. They're like, I'm not going to do this. But I'm like, well, why don't you use something a little bit safer, progesterone? But can't really say it out loud, especially if you're a doctor.
Someone's going to say, what are you talking about high dose? How high is high dose?
I think like 400 milligrams is considered high dose. I mean, so most menopausal women start on 100 milligrams of progesterone, which is what we start with at Reina. If you're going to do a prescription, we obviously do prescription progesterone. Um, but 200 milligrams. I see someone going higher, but my mom's like, I never dose higher than 200 really. And she treated thousands. And so, but I've seen some women that are like, I need 4 or 800 even. I'm like, whoa, okay, well, maybe everyone's a little bit different, or maybe they've been estrogen dominant for a really long time. I mean, the good news is there's no toxic dose. They like test in animals. It's not gonna kill you or anything. It's just gonna make you really drowsy. Which is like our progesterone makers, they have to work, they don't want to get it on them and make them want to take a nap a little bit. So you just get a little too drowsy, which is kind of funny.
Carol
Um,
Peterson had mentioned someone she worked with was doing 2,500 a day before she experienced any sort of relief on her symptoms. How
well,
stressed was that body?
Well, like if I had aggressive cancer, I would do that. I would try that. Why not? You know, if you're gonna, it's like the type of cancer you're gonna die from. Most cancers you don't really die from, you know. But why not? You know, go, just try it. Better than the tamoxifen, which I think like the selective estrogen receptor like tamoxifen, it's honestly a win for the receptor theory because they do work in a sense, but they don't work all the time. And a lot like a huge percent of cases they just don't work. Whether there's no receptor on the tissue like triple negative or they're just the body's just is has resistance to these things. So a lot of cases they won't work. Why not try high dose progesterone? That's what I would do. I would not go into tamoxifen. I would not go on estrogen blocker. I would change my life, get rid of my estrogen load, use pregnenolone, use progesterone. Um, do
I've seen women do better on lower doses than that. Between 50 and 150 milligrams a day, who do really. I've even seen reversal of like chronic depression, where a woman would literally go into a very dark place and literally say, I've just, between 100 and 150 milligrams a day, actually totally reverse that. So I think it
yeah,
does depend on the person. But yeah, I think with progesterone, I've seen it do, and in thousands of applications, I've seen it do some wonderful things. And sometimes people go, oh, it's not working. Well, sometimes you just don't need progesterone. There's another deficit. And you can't think
right.
that progesterone is the only thing. But at the end of the day, the reason, and I say that because I sell progesterone now, and the only reason I started selling it is because I've been using it for many years with clients. And there was no way for them to actively get hold of it. So I just said, right, I'm going to start selling this. And I try and I still would work with some clients and I say, you need to go and progesterone. They go, do you know where to get it from? I say, yes, but you don't have to get it from me because I still want to be clear that I'm not a progesterone
I
hawker.
do the same
But
thing.
it's like,
I do the same thing.
yeah, but I just, it's just one of those wonderful things. I do think some females probably sometimes need to stop after about three to a minimum of 6 months most of the time, just to see how they're doing without it. And
Yeah.
sometimes you can saturate the tissues and be fine for a lot longer. But I think it's worth coming off it sometimes rather than staying on it for forever. But at the same time, it's like you just experiment and see how well it has worked, and if you need to go back on it again. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's a potent anti-estrogen, like you say, and it does all the things that you suggest. Um, I sometimes have a wonder about some women that have experienced endometriosis whilst being on progesterone. It's very, very few and far between, but I often think that they probably had some kind of thyroid issue underlying that.
Mm.
And this is where I think sometimes there can be a need to go on thyroid first. But most of the times, I've seen a lot of females who say low body temperature go on progesterone, and their temperatures actually come up to normal because of that thermogenic response to progesterone, and also progesterone does protect the thyroid as well.
Yeah, and I just to add on, like I think Keith and I are very cautious because obviously people very love progesterone, but uh my mom came across progesterone because she literally was going to die because she's a DS daughter, never had 2 periods in a row, did not menstruate normally, and someone told her randomly, like a patient, I believe it was like, and she was like, you need to try progesterone. At the time, they did not even have it in the normal because before you used to have to inject it like into you because it was really hard to get high enough dose to be effective. So she was injecting herself with progesterone. Never even read repeat, but she was just like on like not doing well. The next day she woke up and she's like, my life is saved. Like my life literally was saved by progesterone. So she started making it in her clinic. There is a law in California where doctors can make their own hormones. They have to follow all the regulation, the hood, the whole thing, but this is the ability for doctors to help their patients directly without, let's say you're in a hospital and you need the medication right then and there. You can't wait for the CVS or something like that. So she started making progesterone a long time ago. Never even read repeat because some people are very protective over this stuff. We don't sell oils or anything. We do creams because my mom had always found success making her own creams and stuff. So I just wanted to say that. And I agree with Keith that like it's not progesterone's not a panacea. Like there's so many other things going on, and no amount of progesterone is going to overcome your stressed life, your cortisol like inducing life, and you eating terrible food all day. It's just an amazing tool presented on Earth that we should, especially women, to take advantage of so that they live long lives. And kind of what in my mind, I have something called how we dose dose hormones is called the all method, where you do everything else before like estrogen. So, because obviously the estrogen to estrogen is very big. So this is what we call, yeah, the all method. You do progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA, desiccated thyroid, or some sort of thyroid as you need it. And then you do that first before you even think about estrogen. That's what we do.
Do you find I've found more and more males responding to progesterone?
We have some, we get that inquiry a lot. Most of our demographics, 99% women, so we don't see it that much really.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people with burn stress, general stress, erectile function improve with low dose of progesterone. And I think with men, it's not something that you want to take chronically, but short interspersed doses can seem to be quite useful. And I'm talking only like 6 milligrams, like 2 or 3 times a week for a couple of weeks, and seems to help. And but yeah, I have seen more people, not all men. It's not something I recommend to all men, but certainly who've come to me and said, I've heard about this. I want to try this. And I say, well, okay, yeah, let's try it on this dose, see what
Yeah.
happens. It seems very beneficial.
Yeah, and prostate cancer, like certain, you know, cancers, it definitely has a great use case for.
Certainly better than castration.
Exactly.
Okay, guys, this has been fantastic. So as we wrap up, I don't know where Georgie is. I'm going to have to email him again. But um, what would be, so Alannah, we'll start with you. Apart from progesterone, reducing PUFAs, and of course, purchasing your new cancer book, what would be three things if you or someone close to you got diagnosed with cancer? What would be three things that you would do or change in your lifestyle to hopefully prevent or change the outcomes?
Um, well, yeah, I guess that those things what we talk about is the unholy trinity, which is estrogen, PUFA, cortisol. So those three things at like the top of the triangle, the unholy trinity would be like lowering the exposure to those three things. I also just think sunlight, which is my biggest downfall in my health journey. I do not go outside because I
You
have
live in
so much.
California,
I
like
know,
you
I
don't
have
even
so
get
much
sun.
work. I bit off more than I can chew, and now I'm stuck inside. So, the sunlight is just like the best thing you can do to reduce your risk of cancers that are actually going to kill you. Like squamous, like a lot of these skin cancers, other than melanoma, are just totally benign, and they don't change your life existence. But the ones that do change your life existence show, you need more vitamin D and more sunlight. So I would do that. Those four things, I guess. That
So the
helps.
PUFAs, sunlight, stress, um,
Estrogen
progesterone, and well, estrogen reduction or not reduction,
reduction,
offsetting.
just minimizing exposure, like
I'd
it's
say
it, it's
liver in that as well.
yeah, and it's not like I people always I had my team write this up for me because people think when you like say estrogen increases your risk of cancer, you're saying they're bad. And like, oh, you're saying PUFA is evil. I'm like, no, I'm saying this is the effect when it's overstepping its biological border. And the trouble is if with being human is we don't know where those borders are really. We can't see them,
Mm,
you know.
mm.
So Keith, what are your three? You did mention liver there.
Yeah, so I agree on sunlight is getting the different rays of light, the red and orange, and even the UV is very helpful. I often find that sometimes when you're getting too much sunlight, liver. I mean, I know there's this anti-vitamin A stance from some people, but I've just found that liver does some wonderful things if you're not getting enough of it and you're exposed to
Mm.
high loads of UV light, because vitamin A and retinol in particular it's a tissue. It helps to differentiate, just like progesterone does, just like thyroid does. I think aspirin is still one of those potent and anti-cancer substances that is essential. I think getting enough sleep is obviously one of the big things as well. Uh,
Ooh.
and for some people who are having chronic insomnia, even putting yourself into some level of kind of inhibition can be very useful short term. You don't need to necessarily. I think sometimes you just need to compartmentalize, because for many people, it's going to come from a different area, and you just need to try and address what that area is, and the body will give strong signals. So let's take vitamin A
Mm.
as an example. You might have issues with cracked skin, you might get more cold sores or something. This can be a good sign that you're vitamin A deficient. So I think it's just, and it is, I understand it is difficult for a lot of people because we have a little bit more knowledge than other people, and we can say, oh, well, that makes total sense. And for the average person, they don't know. I think that's why it's useful to kind of read up on these things, and that's why I'm looking forward to reading your book. To be honest, sounds excellent. But yeah, I think for some people, if we had an extension done in the house not so long ago, and I remember when they were putting in the insulation, they were just cutting the foam, and that was basically flame retardants, and there was dust throughout the whole house. And I never felt so, I felt really dark. And I think it's for some people,
Mm.
depending on their job and what they're exposed to. So perhaps it was a builder for somebody who's exposed to those chemicals all the time. It might be getting more of a sauna or something and sweating that stuff out. I think it just becomes very dependent on the case and subjective to some degree. But like you say, there are foundations: getting adequate sunlight, eating a good diet, eating plenty of fruit, as an example, getting adequate protein in dairy, and regulating calcium. So estradiol doesn't have its kind of exocytory effects on cells. There can be many different things, but yeah, I think also I think, and to quote Ray Pete as well, is having a life that's interesting
Mm.
and
You're
So true.
stimulating and filled with purpose. And that's to a degree where I feel I'm quite lucky that at a later stage of my life, I realized what I really wanted to do.
Mhm.
I love that.
I mentioned as well earlier that I've been using bicarbonate of soda with one of my clients who's battling cancer. You think that's a good idea, Keith?
Yeah, I think some cases where, uh, overall adding it in seems to have some beneficial effects. I think depending on what's going on, sometimes in the tumor microenvironment might dictate how effective that is. But I think overall it seems to have some beneficial effects. I think if you look at some of the studies in exercise where you've used bicarbonate to prevent the onset of lactate accumulation, that can be where some things are beneficial with that. So it just depends. I think bicarbonate isn't something I take on a regular basis. I throw it into my masa pancakes every now and then, and a few things like that. So I get it irregularly. But yeah, it seems to be efficacious in some areas of cancers for sure.
There was a study
Yeah.
that I wanted to bring up with Georgie. Alana, maybe you've heard of this. He had cited a study on one of his other podcasts about Benadryl um, reversing colon cancer. So using Benadryl for 12 days completely reversed colon cancer, and potentially through the histamine serotonin pathways, which
Mhm.
I will ask him about eventually. But that, like, such a simple thing, but also such a short
Yeah.
time. Pretty sure it's up on his blog.
Cool. Yeah, I'll have to read that. But I think baking soda is great. I sometimes will put it in my water because it, yeah, can neutralize the acidified environment.
Mhm.
That's why it's actually also used for diabetes sometimes, like sometimes to treat diabetes. So, and that's right, like all these diseases are sort of earlier manifestations of a full-blown cancer diagnosis. So it makes sense there you solve them a lot of this, like the same lineup could be applied to diabetes or something like that. But that's really cool. I'll have to check that out. Yeah. Sometimes it's like the things that I don't know. We're always looking like I think that the normal person is like thinking there's going to be this moonshot gene cure, which absolutely is not going to happen because genes don't cause cancer, but also because everyone's life is different. So their manifestation of disease is going to look different. And so the things you have to tweak and change are going to be different. So maybe you live in Iowa where, you're most of the farmland's pesticide ridden, maybe you need to move. Maybe you have a stress, like all these things are going to be like slightly different for your story. So it's kind of, but using the tools that kind of apply to everything could be kind of putting the puzzle together. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
there's
the Benadryl thing is quite interesting because um, there's quite a few older studies on promethazine, which I think is an H1 histamine receptor that they used in anti-cancer or cancer trials that seem to be quite useful. I think the cyproheptadine obviously works in a similar pathway. Interesting thing I had recently, I was going snowboarding and I blew my back out, and for 3 days I was wailing in pain. and I was trying to rehab it prior to going. And obviously, I was staying awake at night, often crying in tears because every time I turned over, I was stuck on the landing at one point, wailing at 2 a.m. Obviously, none of my family came out to help me, but I took some aspirin and cyproheptadine 2 days. But bearing in mind, I could hardly walk 2 days before, and I had such a good night's sleep 2 nights before we went skiing. Um, I woke up the next morning after having 10 hours sleep with virtually not moving, and my back pain had almost gone overnight.
Mm.
Um, and literally, everyone was I was sat on the plane, everyone's going, "Oh, you had bad back, did you?" I'm like, seriously, 2 days ago, I couldn't move. And it was literally getting that one good night's sleep. So I think if you put that into perspective, where you kind of talk about the aspects of inhibition, when you can shut stuff down, whether it's from a stress perspective, lowering serotonin, lowering
Yeah.
histamine, which is what Benadryl would do, is you're literally just taking away that stress pathway. And we know that serotonin activates the adrenal responses, it causes, spasticity of arteries and all of these things as well. So I think that's why those particular treatments can be really, really useful for people. And again, not very common knowledge, I think, on that kind of stuff. And that's why I think Benadryl would certainly benefit some people.
Mhm. Makes you think that stress, as we term it, is probably the primary factor in cancer evolution. It's just always been stress, whatever direction that takes or hormone it influences, there's a stress component there regardless.
It was certainly
Yeah.
not the genes, is it?
Yeah. And I think like I always clarify that like one bout of stress, like the body perfect handles all that. Like it's not like one day or one week. Like actually, and this is kind of like my kind of contrarian view is that it takes quite a bit of stressors to cause a full-blown cancer diagnosis. Like I actually think it takes a lot to manifest in like a serious cancer diagnosis. So what that means is like there's a lot of places to get in between that and to avoid these patterns that are like over someone's lifetime. It's never like one day. It's like over your lifetime, what was your exposure to these things? So
Yeah,
It's
you
a bit
don't
like
just
the
wake up.
HPV research. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Keith.
It's a bit like the HPV research, isn't it? Where they've kind of looked at the Gardasil vaccine and said, "Hey, there's been no case in these 10 years," and it's actually why. Well, you're not going to see that come out in 10 years. It's going to take a lot longer for that to manifest.
Mhm. Yeah.
totally. We're gonna see maybe in 20 years, this huge push for estrogen and the estrogen industry, like I'm telling you guys, like it's in full blown like mode right now. Uh and like we're just not gonna know what the effects are gonna be for like 12 years, maybe 15. I don't know, maybe sooner. I don't know. But um yeah, and so like the estrogen blocker industry also is gonna explode too. Like anastrozole and letrozole, like all these things are gonna be even more profitable. So it's just gonna be the side effects take a while to show up. It'll be interesting, I guess.
The estrogen industry is on fire right now. It almost makes you think they're running scared because voices like ours are becoming louder and louder. You look at Keith, probably, maybe you've heard of Dr. Marie Haver, Alannah, no doubt you have. As Carol puts it, her book is terrible, but she's endorsed by the American, even Heart Foundation. She's endorsed by all the pharmaceutical proponents and makers, but people are still lapping up every word that she says. Like something is behind her pushing what she has to say around estrogen.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you give a woman estrogen, she does feel better. She feels better. She feels like it's a very stimulatory feeling. Sometimes we like that's why, cortisol can feel really good. People take cortisol, it feels really good. Doesn't mean it's good for you, but you are giving a woman a feeling better. And I think that's where it can get really complicated because you actually are giving someone a sense of relief, but are you doing it the right way that causes the least harm? Probably not. Because obviously estrogen does increase your risk of cancer. Any sort of like,
And that relief usually is only for a couple of weeks, and then they start to feel worse again.
sometimes it's like for a year. I mean, it depends, I think. Like, because we like treat women up front, I know like I do see both sides of it, is that it can just make you feel good. And so I try to tell women, I'm like, you don't need estrogen to do that though. You can solve hot flashes with progesterone or pregnenolone. You don't need to go on estrogen. But the industry is in full swing. I mean, it's crazy actually. It's like scary.
There's
Okay.
quite a lot of dogma around the use of estrogen as well. And I think when Katharina Dalton died on the BMJ, British Medical Journal, there's an obituary for her. And one of the first comments is this estrogen doctor going, not sad news. It's like, I told her she was wrong. It was always about estrogen that you needed. And I was like, okay, that's quite harsh, but okay, maybe that's an insight on the estrogen dominance.
Yeah. Yeah, and people are like, women are being underserved. I'm like, in what way? Like, there's millions of people that are willing to give you estrogen in this moment for very cheap. I'm like, what, how are you being not served by this? I'm just presenting a different side of things, right? Because like my mom was deformed from an estrogenic drug. Like there's certain realities they just like for some reason can't entertain, you know?
Yeah.
Well,
But
guys, a great conversation. Thank you. We made do. I'm sorry Georgie didn't show up, but I'll figure out what happened and I'll let you both know. But otherwise, you guys rocked it. So loads of information here. Thank you.
Pleasure.
thank, thank you
Okay,
for
Keith
having
off to the gym with you.
Yes, I
Alana.
have to run. Yeah, before the kids get back, and I'll be trapped in the house, but not being able to go.
Okay.
me.
Thanks,
Lovely
Keith.
to meet you, Alana.
Yeah, it was nice meeting you. It was so fun. And thank you so much for having us. And I hope, we can keep jamming and talking about these ideas. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.